So hello and welcome to the Voices from the Hydrosphere lecture series here at the OSU Museum of Art. Today our guest speaker is Jason Aamodt, and this is our first fully virtual lecture series here at the Oklahoma State University Museum of Art. So thank you all for attending today and joining us in this new online environment. My name is Christina Elliott, and I am the Associate Curator of Education for Academic Initiatives here at the OSU Museum of Art. Our marketing specialist, Kristen Duncan, and I will be your moderators for today's talk. We encourage you to introduce yourself or pose questions in the comments. We will allow everyone to unmute after the lecture during the Q&A section of this talk. I wanted to thank all of our partners that we've had in building this series, but that list is quite long, so I'll detail it at the end. And for this lecture in particular, I'd like to give a special thanks to the Center for Sovereign Nations for highly recommending Jason as a speaker, and for the Plattsburgh Alumni Association for really going the extra mile and helping us to promote this event. Both Jason and I hail from SUNY Plattsburgh, where we received our bachelor's degrees and are now in Oklahoma. So imagine that, it's a small world. This lecture series was created to highlight the research and partnerships that were developed in our main gallery exhibition that you see behind me, The State We're in Water, Constructing a Sense of the Hydrosphere. Jason Aamodt was interviewed by our artist and is featured in the film Complex Waters by Robin Lasser. All of Robin's films, as well as more images of the gallery exhibition, can be seen on our YouTube page, our Facebook, and our museum webpage at museum.okstate.edu. Jason Aamodt is a practicing attorney with 20 years of experience working in environmental law and sovereign rights. He received his bachelor's degree in chemistry and environmental science from the State University of New York in Plattsburgh and his Juris Doctorate from the University of Tulsa College of Law. As a lawyer, Jason represents Indian tribes and individuals on a wide range of issues, from environmental contamination, natural resource protection, to land, financial trust, and accounting matters. Some of his accomplishments in this area include settling the 5th largest Indian trust accounting case and establishing a new cause of action against the United States for Indian tribes. He has also been published in numerous journals, including the Denver Journal of International Law and Policy, the Oklahoma Law Review, Natural Resources Magazine, and the Sierra Leone Journal of Biomedical Research. Here at OSU, Jason is a professor in the Spears School of Business, where he shares his knowledge in environmental law, natural resources law, water law, international environmental law, and corporate and sustainable responsibility. He also teaches many of these courses at the University of Tulsa College of Law as well. Today, we'll hear more about Jason's current efforts around surface water quality, really their efforts to protect and preserve the integrity of the Illinois River. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today, Jason Aamodt.
Christina, thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's really great to be here and to have a chance to talk to you guys about something that's really near and dear to my heart, and that's the law and the policy relating to water in Oklahoma. Before we get started, I want to just give a little plug for OSU. It has 2 really great programs in addition to, of course, an amazing art museum, right, Christina? So, but we have 2 really great programs. One in the graduate environmental program. I think Dr. Studley, who's the director of that program, is on this particular Zoom meeting. And so if you're a prospective student or someone that's interested in graduate environmental sciences, Dr. Studley is definitely someone to reach out to. It's a fantastic program that has brought people around the world doing kind of the Lord's work in these issues. And the other is the business school has a sustainability concentration relating to their MBA. So if you're in the business space and you're interested in these issues, there's a way to focus on that either as an independent certificate or as a part of a larger MBA program. And you're happy to reach out to me about that at any time. And I'm happy to talk to you about that. So, but after that, sponsor programming, let's talk about the vistas and valleys. And unfortunately, there's more valleys than vistas in Oklahoma water policy today. I want to focus on Eastern Oklahoma, and I really want us to focus on surface water quality. And I've drilled this down because we only have a half an hour. If we had 2 or 3 days and you all were stocked up with water and food and had endless time, I guess we all have endless time these days, don't we? Our options are endless. We could be talking about groundwater, either for the Ogallala way out west or the Arbuckle in the center of the state. We could be talking about Oklahoma City's attempts at water access in southeastern Oklahoma. We could talk about southeastern Oklahoma's water rights. We could talk about interstate compacts and disputes between the state of Texas and Oklahoma and the tribes. Famously, Texas has tried to come to Oklahoma for water for Dallas. There's a lot to talk about. But there's a really important issue that's kind of near and dear to my heart, and something that I think you probably find interesting as well. I wanted to kind of focus on it with you, and that's this surface water quality issue. So on surface water quality, there's kind of 2 areas. There's again a myriad. So to fit within our time, I think we need to kind of pare it down. And I want to focus on what's going on with in-stream mining in eastern Oklahoma streams, as well as surface water quality. And that's both stream and lakes. And these are some pictures from eastern Oklahoma fairly recently of the real conditions that are going on in our state right now. We think of our rivers and streams in our lakes in eastern Oklahoma as treasures, as jewels, as valuable. And they are, and there also are some significant challenges associated with them. So let's look at these streams in particular. This is a map that I've taken from the Oklahoma Water Resources Board's website, and it shows where streams and lakes are in eastern Oklahoma over here on the right. I've kind of blown up the key for this map so that you can see them a little more clearly. And if you look at this, you see all of these essentially Ozark streams are streams that have special protections on them. They're either outstanding resource waters, or they're high quality waters. And an outstanding resource water is another name for a scenic river in Oklahoma. And high quality waters have largely the same protections. So if you look over here in eastern Oklahoma, all of these fit in that category, and all of them also fit into the category of being nutrient limited. And we're going to talk about that, but basically that means that there are, the land itself is such that there ordinarily would not be nutrients in the watershed to allow algae to grow in a more kind of straightforward way of looking at it. So let's kind of look at these streams together a little bit, and particularly take a look at this question of sand and gravel mining. Now, years back, there was a decision that held that the Clean Water Act, Section 404, in many cases would not apply to sand and gravel mining, but in other cases it would. And so in 2010, as a response to that litigation, the Army Corps of Engineers published some guidance for folks who are sand and gravel mining inside streams and rivers in Oklahoma. So I wanted to highlight a couple of the regulatory recommendations. First is that it's recommended that there's a riparian zone of at least 50 feet wide that needs to not be disturbed at all by mining related activities. If you're unfamiliar with the word riparian, just kind of as a backup, riparian means to be next to water, or to be essentially abutting the water. And so this riparian zone is that land along a stream bank that is next to the water. So that's the first thing, is if you're going to mine inside one of these streams, and really what the mining is for is gravel, pretty base material. You've got to maintain this riparian buffer. And that's important because the buffer itself keeps sediment from running into the streams, helps to absorb nutrients that might run off during stream events. And it also protects the stream itself because as we're going to talk about, the trees over the stream tend to shade it and protect it from the impacts of the sun. And also, the riparian areas tend to protect the stream itself from erosion, and when a stream bank erodes, the stream can widen, and we're going to look at that as well. Then I thought I'd look at A3 on scenic rivers and their tributaries. In-stream mining must have a 100-foot, essentially, riparian buffer. And they have to be operated in such a manner that there are no new discharges to the scenic river. Think about that for a second. We have rivers in our state, rivers and streams. There are 6 of them that are set out as scenic rivers. And we allow the mining of those scenic rivers by rule, which to me seems a little unusual, but that's just me. Let's take a look at one particular case of in-stream mining. This is on Saline Creek, and the operator here is a company known as Ozark Materials. These are 2 air photos of the site, one taken in 1995 and the other taken in 2017. These air photos are publicly available on Google Earth. If you just turn on historical imagery under view, you can see them as well if you zoom in to essentially just above the pump back south of the town of Salina along Hudson Lake in eastern Oklahoma. And this particular stream is Saline Creek right here, the larger creek, and then Little Saline Creek runs into it. It's a pretty important place. I don't know if any of you have been out here, but there's a pretty important recreational area called Blue Hole that's right here. A lot of folks will come out from Tulsa and use this as a spot to swim and to hang out with their families. At the confluence of these 2 streams, to the south of the confluence, there were 2 large trees. There's one now. Those trees are important. There's testimony in a court case involving the stream. Those trees are important to the Native American community that lives near there. There's a large Native American community in the town of Kenwood, which is right along the banks of this stream, a little further upstream. Almost everyone there is Cherokee. It's a traditional Cherokee area. And the stream is important culturally, particularly those trees are important culturally in some of the tribes and the members' ceremonies in that area. So this is an important place in our state and in the Cherokee Nation for a lot of different reasons. Now, if you look over here on the left, you can see in 1995, downstream, right, further to the south, there are these large gravel bars that had been built up by essentially the stream flowing over the limestone rocks for years and years. And so there are these big beds of limestone gravel that had appeared. And Ozark Mining came along, and if you look over here in 2017, they dug it all out. They came along with heavy machinery and trucks and dug in roads, and they took away all of that gravel. And you think, well, okay, so they took away some gravel from a stream. So what? Well, look upstream. If you look in the 1995 picture, you see that the stream itself is quite narrow, and that there's vegetative cover right down to the edge of the stream, all the way along its reaches up above where the mining is occurring. But when you look over here on the right, you see that the stream is much wider now up above, and that the gravel is exposed and the stream itself is exposed. Well, here's what's happened. As this gravel was dug out in the lower area, it caused essentially the elevation of the stream to be increased, to have an increased pitch. That increased pitch then increased the speed of the water that was flowing along the stream, right? And as the water velocity was increasing, that increased the erosion. The erosive power of water is 4 times the change in the increase in its velocity, or to the 4th power, rather, of the increase in its velocity. So if you think about it, it's this exponential change in its erosive power. And you see that right here. Just a relatively small change in the elevation of the stream, which would result in a little bit faster water moving by, has caused the stream bank to erode on both sides. You say, well, erosion's bad, but it's even worse than that. The erosion then took out the trees on the side, including one of the 2 sacred Cherokee trees that were at that confluence. The erosion then, having caused the trees to go away, increased the amount of light that was incident on the stream, which increased the amount of algae that could grow in the stream, which then increased the amount of nighttime respiration, right? And during the day, the algae are making oxygen and putting it into the stream, but at night, those algae respire and they use up all that oxygen, which caused there to be oxygen deficits and fish kills on this stream, which is extraordinary because this stream is otherwise largely pristine, or has been largely pristine. There are some issues that are coming along recently with chicken waste in the watershed, but for the most part, this is what Oklahoma calls a reference stream. It is biologically intact. The animals and fish and insects that live in and around this stream are essentially the way they've always been. And a reference stream is really important because we're doing a great job of extirpating the animals and insects throughout all of the streams in our state. And having a place like this, a reference stream, is an important biological resource for our state because it's some of the only places that rare and unusual species can continue to exist. Like, for instance, in this particular stream, the Oklahoma salamander, which is quite rare, lives on this stream and in very few other places in Oklahoma. So that's one way, of course, that in-stream mining impacts streams, and it's not exactly intuitive. You wouldn't think that doing something downstream is going to impact the upstream reaches, right? But it has a really profound impact. Let's see, there we go. There's also downstream impacts, however, and this is that particular site. On the left, the mining operator was not operating outside and above the wetted perimeter of the creek, violating the guidance. The rock was being mined directly from the creek, and as you can see, it was causing quite a great deal of pollution in the stream as it was being taken out. And then it would drive these giant trucks right down through the stream, kind of spreading the dirt and other detritus that they were digging up throughout the stream and causing a great deal of downstream sediment. All of it violations of the Clean Water Act. And ultimately, Judge Dowdell, a few years back in a federal court case that I was a part of, held that that in fact actually Ozark Mining was violating the Clean Water Act with these activities. So where does in-stream mining occur? It occurs in these streams that we consider to be special. It's in these outstanding resource waters, in these scenic rivers. It's really stunning to me that we're using a resource that we consider to be important for scenic and cultural reasons, instead for essentially the cheapest, basest material that we can buy, gravel. But that is kind of what the decision that our state policy has made and allows. So having kind of looked at in-stream mining, let's now turn to kind of some of the recent events. There's a new in-stream gravel mine proposed on Spring Creek in Oklahoma. I don't know if you've ever been to Spring Creek, but it's a special place. You know, Saline Creek is special too. You get up into the little, essentially canyons that it flows down through, and you feel like you're in, you know, this beautiful place in Colorado. And Oklahoma has places that rival and even exceed the beauty of places like Colorado, and these are some of those places. The mine, I can tell you, in Saline Creek that we have been litigating with is shutting down. But there's active there has been active gravel mining in other streams and rivers throughout that region, including scenic rivers and rivers that are designated as high quality waters, that are these sinks for the preservation of biological resources because they're reference streams. And so it's really inconsistent that at one level the state would impose strong protections for the stream, saying that these streams need to be preserved in order to preserve the biological resources that they hold, right? Where we're going to essentially extirpate them in other areas, but then allow an activity that also extirpates them in this space. It doesn't make any sense. But let's switch to surface water quality. And there's a lot more in the news on this than there is in stream mining, although they're both pretty rough on the streams in this area. This is kind of where some things we're going to learn together, if you don't know them already, are concepts of in-stream water quality standards and discharge limits. So before we kind of get into surface water quality, let me give you a little bit of kind of broad policy background. Since the 1930s, actually even a little bit before that, the United States has been struggling with the idea of protecting water quality. Our streams have for a long time been our sewers. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Cuyahoga River that, you know, routinely burned in the Cleveland area because of the old Standard Oil refineries that would just, you know, belch oil out into the river, and then somebody would drive over the river on a bridge, flick a cigarette out, and boom, you'd get a fire. In the summer of 1969, that river burned 13 times, and so profoundly that it made the front page in the New York Times, kind of right around the same time that the Santa Barbara oil spill was happening, and there were a number of other kind of massive environmental catastrophes, which turned the world's attention, the nation's attention, to the question of protecting our water quality. And if you look at the Clean Water Act, its primary purpose is to ensure that all of the streams and rivers and lakes in our country are, quote, fishable and swimmable, right? Not just some of them, not a few of them, not only in certain places, but all of them everywhere. It also has as an intent to eliminate all discharges of pollutants into stream waters. So while we've adopted, since the passage of the Clean Water Act in the early 1970s, while we've adopted a view that the Clean Water Act is designed to permit discharges of pollutants, in fact, actually its intention is to eliminate them. And it's only our failings to implement the statutory requirement that leaves us in a situation where we haven't built the technology that the statute requires to eliminate the pollution that we're causing. So there's 300,000 feet above the earth looking at these streams. Let's kind of drill down to maybe 60,000 feet. Streams have what are called in-stream water quality standards. And in most places, those water quality standards are just words. The stream should be kept clean, or it'll describe kind of what a cool water stream looks like. But there aren't usually numerical standards for the pollutants that are supposed to be in those rivers. Now, this concept of an in-stream water quality standards left over from the 1950s version of the Clean Water Act, where that's all it did. the Clean Water Act said, we're going to regulate these streams by setting standards, and everybody has to meet these standards. Well, the problem with just doing that is how? How do you meet those standards? And so in 1972, when the Clean Water Act was overhauled, there were discharge limits that were imposed, and that is every point source, and a point source is any discrete conveyance from which a pollutant is discharged into waters. Discharge limits have to be set, right? And those discharge limits are in permits, and the permits are enforceable as federal law, and violation of them doesn't just have fines associated with them, but they it's very tough, right? But the discharge limits are to be set in such a way that the in-stream water quality standards can be met. And the in-stream water quality standards are usually set at such a way to be forcing, right? The standards are to be set that will meet the objective of the statute from the stream, if it's not already, into a condition where it's fishable or swimmable, where it meets essentially the uses that would ordinarily be appropriate for that stream. By the way, just as an aside, in Oklahoma, of all our streams and rivers, I believe this is true, and my numbers may not be exactly correct. Some of you may know better than I do. I probably do know better than I do. But I think that there are only 5 streams left in the state of Oklahoma that are not judged to be impaired for their primary uses. That is, where the conditions inside the stream now are such that the in-stream water quality standards are being met. Well, there's only 5 in the entire state. There's a lot of streams in our state. I don't know how many, I haven't counted them all up, but that's, you know, a percentage, a single percentage point of streams in our state actually meet the statutory requirement of living up to the in-stream water quality standards that have been set for them. So let's look at the Illinois River. And by the way, that was a picture of the Fayetteville wastewater treatment plant. The Illinois River is pretty unique geographically. All of the people live at the higher elevation, essentially, right? Fayetteville, Springdale, Siloam Springs, they're at a higher elevation than down here in Oklahoma. So Fayetteville is 1,400 feet above sea level, but 10 Killer Lake, which is the lake at the bottom of the stream that I hope you've had a chance to go out and enjoy, it's absolutely beautiful, is less than half that height above sea level. So all of the things that happen up in Fayetteville, essentially, and that get into the water there, end up in Lake Tenkiller. Now, this is unique because most cities are typically associated in the lower elevation areas of a stream or a river system. You know, if you think about Philadelphia, for instance, it's at the mouth of the river as it heads into of 2 rivers rather, as they head into the Atlantic Ocean, the Delaware and the Schuylkill kind of meet there in Philadelphia. There are more people at the bottom of the river than there are at the top. So you typically don't have these downhill pollution issues associated with streams and rivers kind of flowing down into somebody else. This is a pretty unique geographical situation. And it led to a really interesting case. In 1992, Oklahoma sued Arkansas and said, hey, actually, I'm sorry, Arkansas sued Oklahoma. Oklahoma set in-stream water quality standards for phosphorus, and we're going to talk about phosphorus in a minute, on the Illinois River. And Arkansas sued particularly because it didn't want to have to change essentially how it was doing business at the wastewater treatment plants all along the Illinois River that were up in Arkansas, Fayetteville, and the like. So the case goes up to the Oklahoma, or rather to the U.S. Supreme Court. It was argued, interestingly enough, by one of my old professors, Robert Butkin, who's now at the University of Tulsa. And the question really was, can Oklahoma set a standard in Oklahoma that Arkansas has to live with in a whole other state? And the Supreme Court said yes. Actually, Oklahoma can do that. that it's allowed to set the standards that meet its requirements, and that upstream dischargers, even in different states, have to comply with that. Oklahoma didn't win outright, however, because the court said that Oklahoma's science, saying that the Fayetteville discharges were having an impact in Oklahoma, didn't have enough science behind them. So let's talk about that science, and let's talk about phosphorus, because when it comes to water quality science, it's all about the P. I thought that was a pretty bad joke, don't you? But P in this case stands for phosphorus. Phosphorus is naturally occurring. It's also limited, very limited in most systems. So you need phosphorus, among other things, to be able to make DNA. And so if you don't have very much phosphorus in a system, then you can't have DNA. And if you don't have DNA, then you can't have life, right? So if you kind of think about it, the more phosphorus you add, if you've got all the other things that you need in the system, and most water systems do, then you're going to end up with more and more life growing as you add more and more phosphorus to the system. Now in Oklahoma, we don't, particularly in eastern Oklahoma, there's not very much phosphorus naturally occurring in the soil. That's why these watersheds are called nutrient limited. Instead, the phosphorus is coming from somewhere else. And where it's coming from is from animal waste, for the most part, and from human beings. So you and I, and the chickens that we eat, are essentially causing phosphorus to be placed into the watersheds in northeastern Oklahoma. When that phosphorus gets there, it causes algae to bloom. In the first picture that I showed you of a hand being held up holding the algae over a river that would ordinarily be just perfectly clear. Now, all of the other nutrients would normally be there, but until the phosphorus is added, the stream can't become clogged with algae. And that's what we're seeing. And it's not just clogged with nuisance algae, as we've seen in Lake Tenkiller and also in Grand Lake in the last few years. We're talking about toxic blue-green algae, algae that can kill you if you come in contact with it. And of course, these are lakes that people come in contact with all the time. I think I've heard it said that on the 4th of July, Grand Lake is the largest city in Oklahoma. I wouldn't be surprised if that's true. And then you stop and you think about the Clean Water Act for a minute. The purpose of the Clean Water Act is to make Grand Lake fishable and swimmable. And yet when we're putting animal waste onto the ground, that purpose is being violated. So that's kind of generally how the science of phosphorus works. And so we fast forward to 2002, right? There was the 92 case. 10 years later, an agreement's reached. I think one of the people that helped to write this agreement is on this in this video chat, and she may have some things to say about it. But basically, there was an agreement to reduce the phosphorus in wastewater treatment plant effluent coming from Arkansas into Oklahoma in the Illinois River. And there were a couple of different stages. There was an agreement to have a 0.037 milligram per liter standard for phosphorus in stream in the river. And Arkansas actually met its first stage in reducing the amount of phosphorus that it was emitting from its wastewater treatment plants. And it had to meet its second stage by 2012. Along the way, we'll come back to that in a second. Along the way, Tulsa sued the city of Tyson, and the focus was on the waste, chicken waste being spread in the Uchee-Spavinaw watershed. At the time, from documents that I've seen that were produced in that litigation, the amount of waste that was being put into the Uchee-Spavinaw watershed without any treatment whatsoever was equivalent to all of the human waste being produced in the city of Austin at that time, right? And all of the water that's generated in that watershed ends up in two little lakes, Uchee and Spavinaw, which end up getting collected and transported down to the city of Tulsa. So congratulations if you have been drinking city of Tulsa water. We now know where it comes from. This was, I think, 2003. There was a settlement, and the settlement has resulted in significant monitoring of this system, and also quite a bit of changes in terms of how much nutrient can actually be spread on the ground. But the reality is that not just in Uchee-Spavinaw watershed, but throughout northeastern Oklahoma, everywhere that chicken waste has been spread for the last 30 or 40 or 50 years, the concentrations of phosphorus are so high in the soil right now that it's going to take decades, maybe even centuries, for that phosphorus to leach out to come to levels that will no longer cause pollution in the streams. Right? If we were to stop putting all the phosphorus down on that could be put down, period, just full stop, not do it anymore in any one of these watersheds, it's going to be decades at least before these streams clean up, because there's so much phosphorus that's already been placed into the system that would need ultimately to be washed out by the streams. So it's a pretty dire situation. And then you've got Oklahoma versus Tyson, which gets filed about shortly after the city's case settles. And the state sued essentially on the same grounds. The state rested its case 10 years ago, 2 governors and 3 attorney generals ago. And yet no decision has been authored in that case. It's 10 years later, and there's no decision. I'm not aware of another case where there was a trial and the evidence was closed and there's not yet been a decision for a decade. And it's kind of because of this. It's no longer Oklahoma versus Arkansas, it's Oklahoma under Arkansas. In 2012, the Attorney General was a fellow named Scott Pruitt, and he delayed the implementation of that 2002 agreement that Arkansas had already agreed to, and said, we really need to have a study to find out whether or not this phosphorus standard of 0.037 is correct. Okay. Well, in 2016, a study was authored and said, you know, it in fact actually is correct. But even since then, Oklahoma hasn't made Arkansas comply with the standard or the agreement that has been, quote unquote, delayed. As you may recall, Mr. Pruitt later became the director of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in Washington, D.C., in large part because he was an advocate against the application of environmental laws to protect natural resources, which is exemplified by his actions in Oklahoma with respect to the Illinois River. And the Illinois River, guys, is really the treasure of Oklahoma. It and the Mountain Fork Rivers, I mean, they're 2 of the real river treasures that we've got. It pays to protect them. So what are we doing right now? We're seeing no pollution, right? It gets even more frustrating because at this very moment, the Water Board, the Oklahoma Water Resources Board, is the state entity that's responsible for establishing water quality standards in the state. It has a proposed rule that would completely gut the 0.03 standard that's been in place for 20 years. And so what it's going to do, if it comes into fruition, is it's going to throw out all measurements for phosphorus during storm events. Well, it doesn't take a whole lot of common sense to know how this works. When you put chicken litter on the ground, and then when it rains, most of that chicken litter is going to end up in the stream during the beginning of that rainstorm, right? You're going to get the biggest push of phosphorus into the stream during storm events. The new Water Board's rule would say they're just not going to measure that. They're simply not going to measure that in terms of trying to understand what the phosphorus impacts are to our streams and whether or not the 0.037 standard is being met. They're also going to test for compliance for the 0.037 standard with what they call a 6-month rolling geometric mean, which makes the standard itself meaningless. If you thought about it, right? If you kind of took all of the things that you're seeing in front of you and you integrated them with some sort of a spatial geometric or time spatial geometric mean, this is what everything that you would look at looks like. You couldn't see anything, right? And then average that over everything that you've seen over 6 months. It's just going to be a blur of color. That's Oklahoma's focus on protecting water resources right now. It's a focus of of blurriness. So I imagine that I haven't brought you a lot of good news. And I wish I had some sort of rosy thing to tell you, but the reality is that our water resources are in really bad shape in the state. They're in dire need of protection. They're, in my view, not being protected. And the policies that are being implemented, whether you agree with them or not, are policies that are designed to foster the economic use of those resources now, and in my view, sacrificing the potential for future generations to have access to them. What we're doing now in terms of the decisions that we're making on putting pollution in these watersheds or mining them out in order to get gravel, which is pretty much available anywhere, is going to make these streams and rivers and lakes unusable for decades or centuries. So that's everything I've got to say. Thank you so much, Christina. Thank you so much to the museum, to the artists for bringing attention to these issues. Thank you for the honor to have a chance to kind of share these ideas with the community. And that's kind of everything I've got. Christina, I'm gonna leave it to you. And maybe moderate or do whatever needs to be done.
Thank you so much for that enlightening lecture. And I think we are all a little bit dismayed and fired up now, but maybe sometimes we need people like Jason to point out these tough, harsh realities and talk about them and help light a fire under all of our collective butts. And so thank you, Jason, for really highlighting this important topic. I am going to allow participants to unmute themselves now. So you should have the authority to turn on and off your mic if you'd like. We also have time for a Q&A. I didn't really see any come through the chat. Does anyone want to start us off with a question for Jason or even a hello?
I see some friends of mine out there in cyberspace. Hi, friends.
Let's see. I'm going to take off the share screen so we can all kind of get a better look at each other too. If you want to turn on your video, you're more than welcome to. I guess one of the questions that I had to start things off, when you were talking about the Saline Creek and obviously all of the environmental impact that this upstream erosion has caused, and it is very visually obvious how much the stream has widened from those shots. There is, like you said, a very important environmental and cultural impact on the Cherokee Nation there with the loss of these that sacred tree and the second one being threatened. How else has this, I'm thinking, how else has this impacted local communities? The stream widening must have had an impact on local infrastructure like roads. You said the development of blue algae, and I know those of you from Plattsburgh, there's been a similar issue with Lake Champlain where people's dogs swimming in the lake, certain types of algae can make them very sick. So maybe just some of the day-to-day what the locals have to deal with in that case as well.
One example is a woman named Annetta Thompson who lives along the stream, and her house, you used to just be able to walk right out from her house to the stream. The stream bank is now 10 feet high. It's dug in and eroded out, and you literally would need a ladder to get down to the stream. There's a number of situations like that along Saline Creek. I'm aware of others, similar situations on other streams that have been mined in Oklahoma. These are permanent changes to the geographic landform, right? We're changing the way these streams look. It's almost insane to think about having a scenic river to even get to anymore. What we're doing. Oh, and by the way, the state has decided during all of this, I should add, to, I think I got a note saying my internet connection is a little unstable, so I think it's better now. During all of this, the state has disbanded the Oklahoma Scenic Rivers Commission. So there used to be a state agency that was responsible for being a watchdog to protect our scenic rivers. This is in terms of other key impacts of, to the extent these streams are used as water supplies, it changes the amount of water treatment that's necessary. Everything about water use is where you take the water, right, is the point at which the water is diverted. And so to the extent that the geographic landform has changed, it's going to change and really increase cities' costs in terms of accessing the water. And this all strikes us right in the pocketbook, right? Because it's about how much you're paying for water. It's about how much taxes you're paying for the municipal water and wastewater treatment systems. We can protect our water systems and pay less taxes, or we can allow these companies to take advantage of these systems and damage them and pay more taxes. So effectively, when you go buy that gravel, the cost of your gravel is not just the cost of the gravel, it's how much gravel you're buying plus how much tax you're having to pay increased because now local cities are having a more difficult situation accessing the water resources or having to treat the water more to be able to get it to you. And we forget about those externalities all the time.
Hey, Jason, this is Kristen. I'm just going to read a couple of the questions in the chat that we've got for you. Okay. We'll start out with a question that we have from Scott. Is there any requirement monitoring associated with stream mining?
Well, in-stream gravel mining is regulated by the Oklahoma Department of Mines, and to my knowledge, I'm not aware of water quality standard monitoring that's required. Instead, they have these kind of narrative standards on what the operator, quote, should do as recommendations. And then if the operator so flagrantly violates them, like the one at Saline Creek did, then it becomes in violation of the Clean Water Act. Then a federal judge will get involved, like it did in that case. But I'm not aware of numerical standards necessarily just generally being applicable.
Wow. I have another question from Lauren. She said that this sounds a lot like what's going on in Wyoming with the fracking. Yep. And coal bed methane extraction. Since the 1872 mining law, it fuels a lot of extraction. Is this relevant here? She also has a two-part question. Also, are there any implications to the McGirt versus Oklahoma decision for changing this policy landscape?
On the first question, yeah, it's a lot like Wyoming. You're exactly right to draw that connection. And it's also a lot like Wyoming in that we're both wrecking really important and valuable parts of our natural biological ecosystem. Those are permanent impacts, essentially. When a species is lost because the stream has been altered and it's no longer available to serve as a refuge, as a reference stream, and that species is now extinct or extirpated, it's not coming back. And if we enjoy the air we breathe, we should be really concerned about biological diversity in this world, because it's only the biological diversity in this world that has created the oxygen that we rely on to breathe, right? So it's really important. On the second issue with McGirt, I have to take a pass on that. I have the great honor and privilege to have the opportunity from time to time to consult with or even represent some Indian tribes in Oklahoma. And they're going to have their views on that, which are more important than mine. And I don't want to get in the way of what their views might be by offering an opinion of my own.
I have another question from Scott Hood. He said that this was a great recap. Thank you. And how are we going to move forward and stop these things? I guess I have a similar question personally of how do we spread awareness about these issues?
Well, I think this is a good thing to have a group of people come together to be thinking about it. I think, share on these comments, get involved, vote. At the end of the day, unfortunately, these kinds of issues have become political. It used to be that a primary Republican tenet was the conservation of our environment and environmental protection. It didn't used to be that one side of the political debate wanted to protect our natural world and the other side wanted to turn it into money. But it's now become that space, and it's really kind of troubling. On the turning it into money, we also need to think about how to do this with our pocketbooks, right? Because if we just increase the cost of every pound of chicken by 1 penny, 1 penny, would you be willing to pay 1 penny more for your pound of chicken in order to know that all of the water resources, not just in Oklahoma, but across the country, are protected against phosphorus? It wouldn't even take that penny, right? We would then probably have enough money left over to solve world peace, as someone on this call had told me yesterday. I'm not kidding. So if we're thinking about the importance of this issue, and if we really do want to think about it in just an economic way, which I think is tragic, but if we want to just look at it in an economic way, we should be willing to pay that 1 penny. And we should make sure that the people that we buy our chicken from actually pay the extra penny. You may recall that the very first effort on corporate and social responsibility was in England, when the English folks who were haughtily putting their sugar in their tea sat down and looked at each other and realized that sugar was harvested and purified by a slave in the 1800s. And they said, whoa, no more sugar. We're not gonna buy slave sugar anymore. And so if you really want to make a change, I think what we've got to say is we're not gonna buy environmentally polluting chicken anymore. If you've gone to the grocery store and bought chicken, just, Tyson's chicken or Simmons chicken or any of those other chickens, that chicken was probably unlikely to stand very much during its life because the bird itself is so genetically modified that its legs aren't strong enough to hold it up. It was confined in a building where it almost never saw the light of day. There was no sunshine. It never saw outside. There were 60,000 other chickens in that space, and it lived for about 6 weeks in total before it made its way into that plastic packaging that you found in the grocery store. So, and along the way, it created a massive amount of waste that needs to be dealt with and put somewhere. So if we want to make a difference, simply refuse to buy commercial chicken. Know your farmer. Find out where there's a local farmer in your community that produces chicken in a small chicken house and takes the chicken waste and uses it in their own garden or their own farm and does so responsibly, and go out and visit their farm and buy your chicken from them. That's how you can make a difference, right? Put the big chicken companies out of business because you recognize that their pollution of our waterways is no better than harvesting sugar with slave labor.
Great words. I feel like it's hard feeling powerless, but as a united body, we can make change. We only have time for a few more questions.
Got this power.
That's great power. I'm going to read a couple more questions, and then if we do have additional questions come in, I just want everyone to know that we can send them off to Jason and provide a link where he can answer questions that you submit that we didn't have time to. I think there might be a few that we don't have time for, but I'll read a question really quickly from Nicole. Where are we at nationally to fight and to protect Clean Water Act? And if successful, how will that help protect the waters of Oklahoma?
You know, there's actually somebody probably more qualified to answer that question than me on this call. I don't know if she'd be willing to be called on, Kelly. You might want to jump in and answer this question. But the reality is that the Clean Water Act is under attack nationally. And they're doing it by changing the definition of what we call waters of the United States. So the Clean Water Act only provides protections where we have decided that the waters in question are what we call waters of the United States. And without getting into a course on constitutional law and the Commerce Clause, which we could easily end up with in a few minutes here, let's just kind of leave it at that, right? But basically, they're waters that are used in commerce in some way, that they either you can float a boat on them or they're used for some sort of commercial enterprise. Which, by the way, when you take a straightforward definition of waters of the United States, is most of the streams and lakes in our country. Well, what that means then is that if you're going to put pollution into one of these streams or lakes, you've got to comply with the objectives of the statute, which is to not put any in there, to make sure that the river or the stream is fishable and swimmable. And also, if you're going to then have a discharge, to discharge within the limits that are required within a permit. In other words, it's like driving your car. If you're going to get in your car, you're going to have a license and drive the speed limit. But for some reason, that seems like too much of a requirement for industry these days. Instead, they want to be able to drive without a permit and to drive their car at any speed they'd like. There's this idea that somehow it's just okay to put pollution in water resources, and the way that objective is being met is by simply saying, well, we're going to keep the law the way it is, but we're going to change the definition of what a water of the United States is, so that permits are only required in very limited circumstances. And that's what's going on right now at a national level. It's even more depressing, perhaps, than what's going on in Oklahoma.
So maybe that's the point where we will stop and reflect on today's topics as we are rounding the 1 o'clock Central time marker. I just want to thank everyone for attending today's lecture. I think it was incredibly interesting and fabulous having you all here digitally. We hope that you can attend the next sessions in this series. And so on October 15th, our exhibition artists, Marguerite Perret and Robin Lasser, will discuss their artworks in the exhibition in more depth. On November 5th, Luann Fisher from the city of Stillwater will speak about wastewater treatment and the human component. And that should also be just as fascinating. To register for these Zoom webinars, please visit our website at www.museum.okstate.edu. You can also find links to our event registration on our social media platforms, especially Facebook. And Jason's lecture will be released next week on our YouTube channel. If you have any questions about any of that, you can find my contact information right on our website, or Kristen's as well. And lastly, we just want to thank Jason again for sharing with us and thank all of our partner organizations in producing this lecture series, including, but not limited to, Allied Arts, the Oklahoma Water Resource Center, Ferguson College of Agriculture, especially their Environmental Science Department, the Center for Sovereign Nations, the Edmund Lowe Library here at OSU, the Plattsburgh Alumni Association, and especially Paul LeDuc, the OSU College of Engineering, Architecture, and Technology, the OSU Art Department, and the OSU Office for the Vice President for Research. and of course, all of the OSU Museum staff, the education and marketing team who were essential in helping me put this together. So again, thank you, Jason, and thank you for everyone who attended.
Thank you.
Great. Reach out if you'd like more information. Otherwise, have a great afternoon.
Take care.